Nvidia put $1 billion into a Korean internet company called Naver last week, and that billion only gets released if Naver first finds $9 billion somewhere else. $1 in, for every 9 that somebody else has to raise. That single condition sits inside the smallest of 3 Korean deals signed in San Francisco on Friday. Deals adding up to roughly $950 billion. Everyone read the big number. The small one tells you what this whole boom is actually running on.
Close to $1 trillion in commitments landed in the one window where no exchange on Earth was open. The Nvidia and SK release crossed the wire at 1:10 in the morning Eastern Time, on a Saturday. Friday's session was long over. Nvidia had closed at $206.84, down about 0.9%, after trading between $204 and $211 all day. So the market has not voted on any of this yet. That's why you probably missed it. Demand for AI compute has not been the binding constraint for 2 years now. Supply has. And supply is really 3 separate queues that have almost nothing to do with each other. Logic chips, memory, and electricity. Nvidia dominates the first queue completely. It controls neither of the other 2. Almost everything announced in San Francisco on Friday was about the second and the third, which is exactly why it read as boring, and exactly why the loud headlines keep landing on the wrong deal. The room that produced this was a summit hosted by South Korean President Lee Jae-myung in San Francisco on Friday. Before the main session, he met separately with Jensen Huang of Nvidia, Sam Altman of OpenAI, Dario Amodei of Anthropic, and Hock-tan of Broadcom. On the Korean side of the room, Samsung's JY, Lee SK's Chae Tae-won, Hyundai's Yuezin Chung, and Naver's founder Lee Hae-jin. By the end of that afternoon, the announced total sitting on the table was roughly $950 billion. SK Group accounted for about $750 billion of that. The centerpiece is the Nvidia partnership, valued above $500 billion, signed as letters of intent covering 2 things: AI factory construction and memory supply. SK Telecom plans a 2-gigawatt AI factory on Nvidia's DSX platform, running Vera Rubin systems paired with SK Hynix HBM4 memory. First facility targeted for 2027. And 2 gigawatts is not a data center the way most people picture one. That's a mid-sized nuclear plant with servers bolted to the side. Samsung Electronics signed a memorandum of understanding with Broadcom worth up to $200 billion. Memory, foundry services, advanced packaging, sub-2 nanometer processes, next-generation AI accelerators. Look at who that partner is. Broadcom builds the custom silicon that hyperscalers use specifically to reduce their dependence on Nvidia. So in one afternoon in one city, Korea sold capacity to Nvidia and to the company most likely to take share from Nvidia. That isn't a contradiction. That is what a supplier with pricing power looks like.
The third deal is the smallest and by far the most revealing. Naver, Nvidia, and Brookfield agreed to expand the GAK Sejong data center from 55 megawatts to 200 by 2028, with a stated long-term target of 1 gigawatt. Nvidia plans to invest $1 billion directly into Naver. Brookfield signed a non-binding term sheet for up to $9 billion. Hold on to those 2 numbers. $1 billion from Nvidia, $9 billion from someone else. They're the whole story, and I'll come back to them. Not $1 of that $950 billion is contractually committed spending on the day it was announced. Read the vocabulary honestly. Letters of intent. Memorandum of understanding. Non-binding term sheet. Subject to customary closing conditions. None of those phrases are purchase orders. Anyone telling you Korea just booked $1 trillion of revenue is reading a press release as an invoice. Useful thing to know before somebody quotes that number back at you with total confidence. A GPU without bandwidth is an extremely expensive space heater. That's why memory keeps appearing in every single one of these deals. High bandwidth memory is DRAM stacked vertically, and stacking it consumes roughly 3 times the wafer capacity per bit compared with ordinary DRAM. That ratio is physics, not strategy. Every wafer diverted into high bandwidth stacks is a wafer that never becomes the memory in your laptop. Industry trackers said earlier this year that high bandwidth capacity for 2026 was already effectively spoken for. Chae Tae-won said the AI companies, Nvidia, OpenAI, Anthropic, Broadcom, are asking his group for far more memory than anyone anticipated. His comment about Huang was that he wouldn't be surprised to hear the figures called too low next time. Read that the way a supplier means it. An order book he cannot fill. Which is why the SK agreement includes a long-term supply relationship and joint development of next-generation memory, instead of a simple price per part. Now the third Q, electricity. 2 gigawatts in Korea. Sejong climbing from 55 megawatts to 200, aiming at 1,000. Grid-scale numbers, committed by companies that do not build power plants, in a country that imports nearly all of its fuel.
Every one of these announcements quietly assumes that transmission lines and generation arrive on schedule, and that assumption is not even the strangest part of what got signed.
Nvidia has stopped selling servers to companies. It is selling national infrastructure to governments. Huang's framing on Friday was explicit. AI factories are the infrastructure nations need to compete and innovate. He described Korea as entering a golden era under President Lee's leadership. Lee used his own keynote to unveil what he called a San Francisco AI declaration. Strip the language away, and this is industrial policy written around one vendor's product roadmap, country by country, and Korea is simply the latest signature.
Now those two numbers I told you to hold. Nvidia's billion-dollar investment into Naver is conditional. The disclosure states it closes only if Naver finalizes at least $9 billion of committed financing separate from Nvidia's own contribution, with Naver funding whatever remains after that. So the chip vendor puts in $1 for every 9 that somebody else has to raise first. And the somebody else here is a Canadian infrastructure asset manager, on a term sheet that is explicitly non-binding. Read that clause twice. That is vendor financing with the risk pushed outward. Nvidia's capital anchors the project, signals confidence, and buys standing with a sovereign customer, while the actual balance sheet weight sits with Brookfield, with Naver, and eventually with Korean lenders. The equity check is small enough to be a rounding error in Santa Clara, and large enough to unlock roughly 10 times its size in Sejong. If demand holds for 20 years, it's brilliant structuring. If it doesn't, the people holding a 20-year asset are not in California. None of this has been priced yet. The release is crossed after Friday's close on a weekend. The first honest test is Monday's open in Seoul, where SK Hynix, Samsung and Naver actually trade, and then the US session after it. Watch which side moves. If the memory names rally and Nvidia doesn't, the market is telling you the suppliers got the better half of a deal announced under Nvidia's logo. That's the scoreboard worth checking.
The bear case deserves the same airtime. Memoranda decay. $950 billion arrived with no published schedule, no milestones and no penalty for walking away. Korea's first 2-gigawatt facility is targeted for 2027, which in data center construction terms is roughly the day after tomorrow. Grid connections, HBM4 yields and customer prepayments all have to land in sequence. Judge this by what gets built and energized, not by what got announced under stage lights on a Friday afternoon. Memory is the shortest transmission line between an AI build-out and a price tag in your own life. You'll feel this long before you ever see a gigawatt. When wafer capacity swings toward high-bandwidth stacks headed for data centers, ordinary drum gets tighter, and that shows up in laptops, phones, graphics cards, and consoles. For most households, the AI boom arrives not as a chatbot, but as a line item on a spec sheet. The second thing that changed is geography. A year ago the question was which company gets the chips. Increasingly it's which country gets the allocation. Negotiated head of state to chief executive, with equity stakes, term sheets and declarations attached. Korea's strategy is to be indispensable on the supply side rather than competitive on the model side. And Friday suggests that strategy is working. Access to compute is now a diplomatic asset, priced accordingly. So here's the clause I promised. $1 billion from Nvidia, released only after somebody else commits 9. That single condition tells you more about the state of this boom than the $950 billion headline ever will. The strongest balance sheet in the industry has chosen to lead rounds rather than fund them. Nobody's stock moved on Friday, because almost nobody read past the first line. If you think I've read that wrong, argue it in the comments, and send this to whoever forwarded you the headline version. Alright, that wraps it up. Like, save, subscribe, and we'll dig deeper next time.